I'm Julie Bartolotto, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society of Long Beach. I welcome you here to our public oral history evening featuring Long Beach City Council member from the 3rd District, Suzi Price, and she'll be interviewing a former City Councilwoman, also from the 3rd District, Renee Simon. I'd like to thank Kiesel, Young, and Logan for hosting us today, and Richard Brown for his hospitality and underwriting, and Kiesel's underwriting of tonight's event. I'd also like to acknowledge Lynn and John Pullman for underwriting the videographer so that this event and interview can be made available to people after this evening. The Historical Society of Long Beach has a museum and archive in Bixby Knolls. We work to preserve the history of the city and to create an inclusive community narrative through our exhibits and programs like this one. Tonight, we'll highlight the work of a local feminist and raise people's awareness to what it was like to work with the city in the 1970s. The event raises important funds to preserve the Historical Society's collection, and I encourage you to support the organization even further by becoming a member if you're not already one. We have some special guests to acknowledge here tonight: Harbor Commissioner Bonnie Lowenthal, the Honorable Betty Carnett, former Harbor Commissioner Doug Drummond, and former 3rd District Council member, and former 1st District Council member Evan Browdy. And I believe Corey Allen may be here representing the 1st District for Lena Gonzalez. This evening and this event follows in the footsteps of our Mayor's Oral History series and the interview that we did with Betty Carnett last year. In 2009, we held conversations with all the past living mayors of Long Beach at the time: Mayor O'Neill, Mayor Eunice Sato, Mayor Tom Clark, Mayor Bob Foster, and Mayor Ernie Kell. Fortunately, these interviews were recorded, and they're on DVD, and we've packaged them for sale, and we sell them in our gallery. The HSLB's collections include the records and papers of many elected officials, and one of our projects this year is cataloging Mayor O'Neill's collection. I'd like to thank you for being here and supporting the stories that shape Long Beach history, and I'd like to acknowledge a few people who helped organize this event. First, volunteer and advisor Ian Patton, historian and board member Kay Briegel, and the treasurer of the Historical Society, Christy Fisher. Our special guest interviewer tonight is Long Beach City Councilwoman Suzi Price. Councilwoman Price attended CSULB, earning multiple degrees there, and attended Santa Clara Law School. Today, she is Deputy District Attorney in Orange County. She chairs the Alameda Corridor Transportation Authority and works on several other committees as a councilwoman. She was first elected to the council in 2014, and she was recently re-elected. Like Councilwoman Renee Simon, and as if that's not enough, like Councilwoman Renee Simon, Councilwoman Price also has young children at home while serving on City Council. I'd like to introduce our extraordinary guest tonight, former Long Beach City Council member from the 3rd District, the Honorable Renee Simon. Before entering politics, Renee was already one of the most accomplished women you might meet. She entered college before the age of 16. She went on to graduate school at Stanford University, where she earned an MS in biochemistry, and later attended UCLA, where she earned another master's degree in library Studies. Coming to Long Beach was a bit of an accident, a story which no doubt she'll share with us tonight. But once she was here, few people have put such a profound stamp on our city or had such a ubiquitous presence in civic life here. She served on the city council from 1972 to 1978. Her civic involvement continues today. She's made Long Beach her home for well over half a century and witnessed firsthand immense changes, and she participated in creating some of those changes. Our guest tonight, with her trailblazing career, is the local embodiment of the feminist movement. Please welcome to the Historical Society, Councilwoman, the Honorable Renee Simon.
Well, thank you everyone for being here, and I want to start by thanking the Historical Society for inviting both myself and Renee to share this evening with you. I will say that when I got Christy's email about participating in tonight's event, I didn't hesitate for even a single second to respond in the affirmative. And the reason for that is that Renee was one of the first people I reached out to when I decided to run for council. For a variety of reasons. First, I know that because she served in 1972, that it had been 41 years since we had had a registered Democrat representing the 3rd District, which was relevant for me because when I ran, I was a registered Democrat and I was 41 years old. And so I wanted to reach out to her and kind of get a background from her a little bit of how she liked the experience. And what I learned and what I continue to learn about Renee is that every time you talk to Renee or you read about Renee or you hear about Renee, you learn something new that she did for the city or that she contributed to this city. And she is by far the most modest and humble person I've ever met. So she doesn't really boast about what she's done. But I'm looking forward to tonight being able to ask you. I am a prosecutor, so I will not cross-examine or ask leading questions, but I'm curious about a lot of things, and I want to, and I know the audience is as well, and I want to explore those with you tonight. So thank you for being here. Welcome.
It's going to be fun talking with you, Suzi.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you. So we're going to start kind of at the beginning, and from there we might fast track a little bit and talk about your political career and your civic engagement. But what I want to start talking about first is where were you born and how did you end up in Long Beach?
Well, it's nice of you to ask because my grandson, who is here from Spain, was commenting about English spoken with people with a New York accent. And I said, how would you know? He said, I just talked to you. So, yeah, I had hoped that I had somehow lost the New York accent, but I get us there. I grew up in New York, in Brooklyn. And came to California to go to graduate school at Stanford, and came to Long Beach because my husband at that time, he and 2 of his classmates at Stanford Law School decided that they would like to open an office together, and in those days, it was quite acceptable to have a small neighborhood law offices rather than joining a cast of thousands in large firms. And so the 3 guys took off down the coast to find a town that would welcome 3 new lawyers. And they had to go 350 or so miles till they got to Long Beach, but were very welcome. Yeah, we'd love to have three new lawyers in town. And so we came, and they said it was February or November. It was November, and it was a beautiful sunny day. People were out on the beach, and they said, looks like a great place to us. And so the 3 guys, 3 pregnant women, and that's all we knew about Long Beach was that they were welcoming 3 new lawyers, and it was a lovely place to live.
Now, when you arrived here, were there things that you immediately liked about it? And what was the contrast to Brooklyn?
Well, nothing's like New York, but well, it's interesting because I have been a lifelong member of the League of Women Voters. In college, the wife of my English professor my college was a small women's college in Long Island where Democrats, you might find one or two here and there. But she had said, girls, you have to join the League of Women Voters. And I have done that ever since. And so when I got here, that was one of the first things that I chose to do. And with that, I discovered that unlike New York, you could walk into City Hall, you could talk to a council person by his first name, and it was a whole different feeling. You could feel like you really could be a part of the government here because it was small. We had about 300,000 people, and compared to 8 million in New York, it just seemed like a very small town, and I guess it was at that time.
Now, what did you do when you got here to get yourself immersed in the community? What were some of the things you participated in, civic efforts that you did?
Well, it's interesting because I got involved with things that were important for my life and for the life of my family. So one of the first things I got involved with was the co-op nursery schools. And we had co-op nursery schools all over the city. And so as I became the director, the chair of all the co-op nursery schools in Long Beach, you got to know people throughout the city, not just where we were living in the East End, but even people across the river in the far West End. And then we got involved with concern for libraries. And at that time, there was a pretty great controversy about what kind of books the library was having, and you couldn't, how dare you have available in your library The Last Temptations of Christ. And so we developed a Friends of the Library as an effort to support the city librarian. And again, we got to know people in libraries all over the city as a consequence of that. So each of the things I got involved in were really things that put me in touch with people all over Long Beach. It just so happened.
Now, you raise an interesting point. You talk about being involved in the co-op preschools and the library. How much of those interests were influenced by you being a mother?
Well, nursery school certainly had something to do with it. No, I don't think it was really being a mother. I think it was just being somebody who was interested, who cared about the community and had this opportunity because it was a community that you could get your arms around. It was small. And so that's what really gave me the impetus to be involved, was because even as a member of the League of Women Voters, just as a citizen, you really could feel that you could get your voice heard, even maybe to pay attention, but you could get your voice heard.
I want to go back a little bit because you kind of brushed over your academic accomplishments. And I know, you went to Stanford, which is an incredibly impressive accomplishment. But before that, you were at a small women's college. Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that experience and how that was, and whether there were points of inspiration for you that kind of stayed with you during your life.
That's interesting. The college I went to, which was then about 400 women, a very small school, barely hanging on by its fingernails financially. And my interest was, I thought, in chemistry. Should have been someplace else, but it was in chemistry. And one of the things even then, it it was so matter of fact that you didn't even question it. This was 1948. And the head of the chemistry department had said to we women, there were maybe 8 or 10 of us in the chemistry department, don't expect to get a job in a lab. As a woman, maybe they will give you an opportunity to work in the library or translate, you've studied German and French, and then if they get to know you, they may invite you, give you the opportunity to work in the laboratory. And nobody questioned that. And what that came fruition was, after my kids were maybe 8, 10, 12, I began to think I could go back to work. And at that time, PCH in Seal Beach didn't look like it does today. It was kind of wide open in fields. But Dow Chemical had a plant there, small plant. And so I presented myself to Dow Chemical, and I said, I'm a biochemist, I've got a graduate degree, I'd like to come work here if you have an opportunity. And they said, we don't hire women. Now, how about that? This is before, the early 60s, I guess, mid-60s. And I said, well, I see women. Oh, well, this is the front. These are secretaries, but the lab is in the back, and we don't have women. And I said, oh, and I left. I didn't stomp my feet or have hysterics. And so that was an interesting experience. And the fact that still surprises me is that I wasn't surprised. But I'd been prepared by the head of the chemistry department in my women's college. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because as I listen to your story and reflect upon my own career, in 1999, when I joined the Ventura District Attorney's Office, they had just allowed that year women lawyers to wear pantsuits, which I wholly took advantage of. But did you feel like you witnessed a lot of progress since that time until now?
Well, when I was elected to the city council, I would no more have dreamed, have imagined, have considered wearing pants to come to City Hall, to downtown Long Beach. I mean, it was just unheard of. So, yeah, I think a lot of change.
There's still a lot of change, but I'm sure you would agree, knowing what I know about you, that there's still a lot more to be done.
Well, I'm counting on you to make that happen.
Now, I know that when you first joined the city council in Long Beach, well, let's go back to, what made you decide to run for office? Where were you at in your life, in your head? What were you hoping to accomplish?
Well, I think as a member of the League of Women Voters, one of the programs that we had was to be observers at the Planning Commission, observers at the City Council, and we would sit there and just listen. And it didn't take a lot to realize that somebody else could do a better job, or at least improve on things.
Back then.
Yeah. No, those were really. We will discuss and describe Long Beach government in 1970s, and you could not really imagine what was here. Yeah, and so I had a friend, an acquaintance, who was the political guru in Long Beach, Don Foltz. Maybe Don's name rings a bell with many of you. He was a very, very savvy political person, and he guided me through this. I wouldn't have known how you even begin to run for anything. But his guidance. My husband had they had a law office in their own law building, and they had a separate room, and so an unused office, which they turned over to the campaign. But it was really a combination of realizing that things could be better, and that if we could get elected, we could make a difference. And that's really what pushed me into it.
Tell me about that first campaign. What was it like?
I went to talk with one woman I knew who was on the city council in Los Angeles, Pat Russell. Pat was the second woman ever elected to the LA City Council. And I said to her, can you give me some advice? And she said, well, Renee, I think the thing that was my greatest asset was my name. She went by Pat, not Patricia, and said people didn't know I was a woman. And she felt that was a big asset for her. Yeah. And because the things that I cared about had created for me an opportunity to know people all over the city, that was a big advantage in running for city council with the way the city elections were set up at that time. And so at that time, the city council was a very logical, very sensible thing, but it didn't work very well. We have 9 council districts. In the primaries, people would select, turn out 2 candidates from each of the 9 districts, the top 2 candidates who won the most votes from each of the 9 districts. So you were nominated by your own district, but then you had to run citywide. And this is 52 square miles. We lived in the 3rd district, is tucked away in the East End. But to be known, for people to vote for you across the river or North Long Beach or any place else was pretty hard. But I had the advantage of having made contacts with people throughout the city because of the co-op nurseries, the Friends of the Library, various things. And so getting elected ordinarily for the city council, I may be jumping ahead, but required you to be able to solicit enough votes from people who didn't even know your name. And the only vehicle that the city was available in the city was the newspaper. The Press Telegram at that time, which was owned and run by the Ritter family, would print before the election. They'd print our recommendations for who to vote for, and people. It was our town, our newspaper. People felt very good about the newspaper, and so if they said, well, if that's who they're recommending, they know all over they know all these people. Well, people would clip it out and take it to the polling booth with them and vote for the people that the newspaper editorial board had recommended. And I was not one that they would have recommended. But
Thanks a lot, Rich. Thank you.
And so the system made a lot of sense because a council person would feel responsible for the whole city because you were elected citywide. But it was a difficult thing to do unless you had the endorsement of the newspaper. And that's what happened to the city. The people who got elected were elected because they had the endorsement of the newspaper, and if they wanted to be reelected, they were really beholden to whatever the newspaper administration chose for them to do, and that's what happened to the city.
Now, when you were on the campaign trail during that first campaign, let me ask you, what was the most common question that you got? Was there a particular question that kept coming up?
The 3rd district, the only Democrat. Well, I'll vote for you for the city council if you promise not to run for anything higher.
Yes, I'm familiar with that question. One of the questions that I got a lot of, the question that I got most, and I wonder if you got it too, which really, for whatever reason I can't explain, has an emotional trigger for me, was how in the world are you going to do this? You're a mother and you have a full-time job. How in the world are you going to do this? And rather than probably answering the question thoughtfully and patiently, what I would say is I'm going to do it the same way my predecessor, who's a male, did it.
That's right.
Did you ever get asked that question? And if so, how did you respond? Because I imagine my response is a little bit more accepted today because of the work that you and others like you have done to pave the way for women. But what did you do at the time?
Well, that's true. My children were a little bit older, so they didn't have to feel I was abandoning them. But it was not common.
The babysitter's doing a great job. I'm fine. I'm just kidding.
No, that was, because it's not the role of women. You know, the woman is supposed to be home taking care of the family, cooking dinner, dusting, whatever you do. I must admit I never did those things. I was a good cook. I took care of the food. But that certainly was one of the kinds of issues that people discussed. But I think too, people knew me, and so it wasn't quite the same way. They were really more concerned that they're not promoting a Democrat to something more than the city council, which is nonpartisan. Yeah.
Now, once you got on the council, let me go back. How about fundraising? Did you have to fundraise at the time? And if
Yeah.
do you remember how much?
Oh, yeah. If you had the endorsement of the newspaper, nobody ever thought about raising money. They didn't have to raise money. They didn't really, you didn't see flyers and mailers and whatever. But we raised, I think, about $25,000, which was unheard of for a city council race. But we did have to do a lot of, I used to think the best thing that they could do is if they would just give us free postage. That would take care of everything else, yeah. But I was fortunate. My husband knew a lot of people in the community, and I didn't. We had people who were able to make, $100 contribution, which was wow, yeah. But, and so raising money, but it wasn't. I don't recall raising money to be the kind of stressful thing that it would be today. We didn't have a lot of fundraisers in that regard, but a lot of people were willing to pay to change the system. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, tell me what it was like when you got on the city council. Give us from your lens, what was it like to walk into that environment?
I'll tell you, I had one acquaintance, friend really, who was a part of the city. He worked for the city. He was a department head. And he said to me, we were standing in the old city hall, and we were standing outside in front of the elevators, and he said, Renee, the city manager has said that no department head may talk to Renee Simon unless somebody else is there to be sure you're not saying something you oughtn't say. I mean, I was really unwelcome, and there was a sense of, I think people who were running the city were fearful. They didn't know what this unknown quantity might do or say, and it's true, I did do and say a few things, but
Which is what I think we love about you.
yeah, but there was great apprehension, and I think within City Hall, it was kind of a black day, you know. This strange woman, this League of Women Voter woman who reads everything. I mean, I could sit at the council table, and some of my colleagues would be opening, undoing the agenda packet at the council table for what we were going to be discussing that day. So it was, you know, I was obviously a different breed for what had been serving on, well, and, you know, Ruth Bach, 18 years prior, was the same kind of woman, but I don't think there was quite that apprehension maybe then.
Now, you know, I've heard the term good old boy network as a practicing attorney. I think I may have actually said to a judge once, I'm not going in chambers to discuss this case because I don't want to be good old boyed. Let's just say that did not go over well. But when you got to the city council, did you find that there were deals and negotiations and things that happened in a network or in a clique type situation that you were not a part of?
I didn't know enough to recognize it was there. Yeah. I had two other people on the city council who were concerned about doing what was best for the city. Tom Clark and Jim Wilson. And Jim Wilson was the first African American elected to the city council. And he was really a good guy. And Tom Clark, who was also a thoughtful, concerned person. But other than that, there wasn't anyone, I don't think, on the city council who had an agenda or cared about issues or, you know, we're concerned about where the city is going. And the city was at that time really going downhill in a bad way. So and anything I would suggest would be automatically turned down. So I knew if I had something that I thought might be a good idea, either I had to find somebody else to front for me, I would ask Tom Clark or somebody else, because if I introduced it, it would automatically fail. So,
do you think that is had more to do with you being a woman, or had more to do with you being a smart woman whose ideas and logic might make others feel less than?
probably both.
Did you ever have moments where people said, you know, please don't ask so many questions, or can you please not talk too much on my item? Or I get that sometimes. Did you ever have that? Did you ever have those kinds of things happen where you felt like in order for you to be successful as a policy leader, you had to basically, I don't want to say make yourself small, but kind of learn to work within the parameters that you were given?
Yeah, and you know, at that time, statewide, there were maybe 15 or so women on city councils throughout California. And so we had, Pat Russell suggested we created this organization called California Elected Women for Education and Research. See, we're a very complicated name, but that's how women did things. And this was all, we knew if we were only going to have elected council people, it was a very small group. So it was any elected woman, women judges, city clerks often were elected. Any elected woman was welcome in this group. And today, this is a very, very powerful organization based in Sacramento, now called Women Lead. Women Lead. But as a consequence, I could talk to other women who from other cities, and Sheila Pokers, who's sitting there and was on the council in Lakewood at that time, and get a sense, because I didn't know how to be a council person. I knew the city charter inside and out because that was the issue that I was studying for the League of Women Voters. But and that's when I discovered that what was happening in Long Beach was not happening anyplace else in California, and that was an eye-opener too.
Tell us a little bit about that. What was happening in Long Beach? And would you like to have some water? I've been asking you a lot of questions, and I haven't given you much of a break. But I will tell you, as you take your sip of water, there's a lot of things that you're saying that are, analogous to things that might still be happening.
Wow.
So not exactly in the same way, but history takes different shapes and forms. But I'd love to know, what was happening at that time when you became a policy leader in this city?
In 1976, the Los Angeles Times finally broke open Long Beach's ugly little secret. And they titled the article, "Government by Newspaper." And the editorial group at the then Press Telegram, which is not anything, I use the name because it's got the same name, but that is not the newspaper today, okay? They literally ran the city because people who were elected to the city council were beholden to the newspaper's support and endorsement if they were going to get elected. The city council selected their city manager. Therefore, the city manager was also under the thumb of the newspaper. And for example, we had no staff. There were 2 secretaries in City Hall. The mayor had 1, and the other 8 of us shared a secretary. And so it occurred to me that it might be helpful to have a staff person who could help us, come up with ideas, or you've got 4 or 5. And so I had suggested to Tom Clark that at that time there was a federal program, CETA, the Employment Training California, no, I don't remember, Comprehensive Employment Training Act, I think it was CETA. And the federal government would make funds available to cities where there were unemployed or underemployed people, and the city could apply for and use these CETA funds to hire somebody. And so I said, hey, we could hire a staff person for the city council and use CETA funds. And Tom said, well, the first people you have to talk to is the people in the Press Telegram. Because, he said, nothing will ever be adopted by the city council unless the newspaper supports it. Now that was Long Beach in 1972. So he even made an appointment for me, and we went to talk to Dan Ritter, Sam Cameron, Don Ohl, he was the editorial staff person. And they said, well, why would you want any staff people? I mean, the city manager has staff people, and I had 1/8 of a mayor, of a secretary. What more would I need? And only Tom Clark and I were sitting in that room who understood what you would do with it. But they didn't think that was a very good idea because we might learn things that we were not allowed to know, truly. And there was such a lack of information that it was very difficult to even make rational policy decisions. So we went to talk to them. They didn't think that was a great idea. We would be stepping on the work of the city manager. It would be costly. What do you need? Waste all that money. We know what you're a big spender. And so I had a weekly column in what was prior to being the Gazette newspapers. We had a little newspaper in Belmont Shore area. And I could write a column once a week. Occasionally, if I could get enough contributors, I sent out a newsletter. But they had an editorial board. They had a daily newspaper. They could editorialize about what a crazy idea this was. And much to my amazement, maybe because the city manager didn't want to forego the funds that could come in, or maybe whatever, he did go along with, and we did get I was allowed to hire a person. And I had a really great woman, and she was a single mother. She was a college graduate. She was unemployed, but she was very bright. And so we hired the first staff person, to help us. But the thought that if you want to get nobody else was coming up with ideas, but I had a lot of ideas of things that we could do in the city, but they would have to first be supported by Sam Cameron, the business manager of the newspaper, or you could forget about getting anybody else on the council to support it. So it was a really sick city. It really was. It was a very sick city.
So now, do you think that idea, that reality has changed? I mean, maybe it's not Sam Cameron's approval that you needed, but do you think that in politics there still remains a limitation to what you can introduce as a policy leader if you don't have backing by certain people or individuals, groups?
I'm sitting on the outside now. But I really believe in this city, and what I've seen, like when we tried to get the general plan amended, the people have a very strong voice, which they didn't have then because they didn't even know they needed to have a voice. They assumed that the newspaper was one of us and on our side. And so, yes, I think that there's a considerable difference as far as the influence that the power of the people has today. Yeah.
Now, you talked a little bit about the newspaper and the role of the main paper in the early 70s. What do you think, if you might be speculating, but what do you think their motives really were in terms of the information they put out, the messaging that they gave, the candidates that they supported? What was the end goal?
When the Ritters bought the Press Telegram, Independent Press Telegram, Long Beach had access to all the offshore oil that was drilled. And it was not until several years later that Mr. Mallon, who was a Long Beach resident, brought a lawsuit which went to the state Supreme Court. And the state said, oh no, just because you're fortunately geographically sitting there on a pile of oil doesn't mean that only Long Beach should benefit from the state tidelands. And so that changed miraculously. And the state gave us $9 million a year of the offshore oil money. They dictated that the state said you can only use it for projects that are shoreline projects, as it is today. So we could use that money for beach maintenance. We could use that money for developing the port. We could use the money for building an Olympic pool. Not one quite as massive as we're going to get, but anything that was on the shoreline. And then that, over time, dropped down. We get $1 million a year, I think, now from the Mallon decision. But the Ritters came to Long Beach and said, hey, this is a thriving, up-and-coming community with all this money, all this oil money, from which we could develop a large readership. And I believe that initially that was their intent, that coming to the city was giving them an opportunity to get to see a city that was growing that they would get benefit from as a newspaper. After the Mountain decision, we no longer had that wealth here that we started with, but they discovered the power that they had to run the city. And they substituted that power for running a big newspaper base to instead, in fact, truly running the city.
And I know this is asking you to speculate a little bit, but what do you think the source of that was? The desire for power?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When we bought the Queen Mary, Sam Cameron said, you have to realize that Long Beach, until that time, the personality of Long Beach was really a city with an inferiority complex. And they kept thinking, we'd be great, but we've got Los Angeles right here to, it's our right there to take away our influence. And so it was a city that kept trying to be better than Los Angeles. Well, I mean, it's a little town. And so that was really the impetus. And when they bought the Queen Mary, Sam Cameron said, well, this will really be the wow feature. That now we'll really be able to be like a big city up the freeway. And that's all it took. Sam Cameron's idea, translated by phone to the city manager, who then executed it. And the assistant city manager said it that later on I was talking with him, and he said, I didn't know that was even going to happen. This is the assistant city manager. He said, I knew they were talking about the Queen Mary, but I didn't know, they were really doing something, going to try to do something. And, but the decision making for something as massive as that was just a couple of people. And then, from the city manager telling the mayor what a wonderful idea this is. Oh, wow, yeah, wow, we're going to be a big city. And so they had, if you can imagine today investing, $3.5 million of money that really wasn't ours anyway, it was the state's, without knowing, buying a blind article. They had no idea of what the condition of the ship was, no idea of what it meant to own an ocean liner, what you do with it, which union is going to be running this thing. And so the head of the building department, and I can't remember who else, two of them, they happened to be in New York, and they did a walkthrough. Well, Joe Prevotell is sitting here to tell you about the condition of the ship when he took over on it. The wiring, the electrical, everything about it was, they said, oh, it looks good to us. And so that was that was the only research that anybody did before the city bought the Queen Mary. And our hope is that the new lessees and have some ideas, and I hope that eventually it will become what it, it's a draw. It is a draw, but it's been a big drain financially on the city for a long time. And
I
but
know
that's how the decisions were made.
I saw our city auditor here earlier. Laura, are you here?
Yeah.
Did you listen to all of that? I have talked with Ms. Dowd about some of those same concerns. But yes, a decision of that magnitude would probably not happen in that way today, which is a good thing. But I will say that, there are definitely some pivotal points in the city's history that occurred at that time. The purchase of the Queen Mary was one of those things. During your time there, what else do you think happened that you were witness to or a participant of that really were pivotal points in the city's history?
I was seated beginning of June, and several weeks later, the city council was to adopt the city budget. And I received in my house the proposed budget, which I, being a good legal woman voter, I read page after page from beginning to end.
Did you get criticized for asking too many questions about it?
I didn't even get a chance to
Just
ask
curious.
questions. And so it should have occurred to me, we had a morning meeting, we had lunch. We used to meet at 9 in the morning on Tuesdays. And then after lunch, was the discussion about the city budget. I should have thought, that's strange to let that go that long. And so one council member across the table from me said, I move that we adopt the budget, page 1 through whatever the end was. And the second one said, I second that, and totally, unconventional. I said, wait a minute, I got some questions. And one of the things that really struck me of all the things was one page was essentially blank, but for a big number, I don't know, some hundred of millions, I don't remember what it was now, which was for capital projects. And you didn't know what the city would be buying with that money. It was just a wide open, and I said that didn't seem quite right. And so afterwards I said to the city manager, we ought to have like a 5-year capital improvement program, and we should, I could go to the city manager and say, in my district, I really would need X. And if he felt kindly towards me, that could get funded. But my colleagues wouldn't know. They had no say. And so what we had the next year, I will say this for him, he really listened. And the next year we had our first 5-year capital improvement project. All the things year by year. That was an enormous step. Year by year, what would be funded, how much, where, and everybody could see what was, what's going to happen in my district, I think that was one of the most critical things I could offer at that time.
And that is something that we continue today. And like I said, every time I talk to you, I learn something new, and I didn't know that idea originated with you. So that's amazing. Thank you for that.
Wow.
Because it really helps the council members, because you're able to go back to your district and talk to them about where their money is going to be spent. And it's not a fight they have to fight every year, because they get a sense of what's coming and they can plan for it.
And it was, the idea of having council district budget hearings or even public citywide budget hearings did not exist. It did not occur.
Now, we're going to be nearing the end in a few minutes here of our first segment, and then we'll continue after a brief break. But I want to kind of end on this note. One thing that I know was important to you, just knowing who you are and what you've continued to commit your time and energy to, I know that civic engagement and listening and having meetings and taking input was important to you. How do you think that has changed since you were on the council, and what opportunities are there from a person now who is engaged from the outside? What opportunities are there to improve upon that?
Well, as I said previously, I am really delighted at the public involvement that is when an issue is really hot for somebody, like the adoption of the city plan, the general plan, then I don't think anything prior all the way back to Prop 13 generated the kind of anxiety in the community. But because it was of concern, the council and the mayor felt obligated to develop a policy that would at least be acceptable to enough people. So the concept of public involvement, which didn't exist in the 70s, is, I think, a critical change from at least at that time. And Jane Jacobs years ago wrote The Death and Life of American Cities. And she had said, the life of a city exists on the street. People are out talking to each other, interacting, and that's what makes a city a good city. And that this is probably the image of the greatest democratic situation, is that the city will reflect what the people really want. That's what's going to make a city, is when the concerns of the people are what get expressed. We may not always be very happy with what people want our city to be when it's not what we want it to be, but nonetheless, that's the real clue. And the city we create for ourselves is the city we're going to have.
Well, that's a fantastic note to end our first segment on. So everyone, please refresh your drinks, get something to eat, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes.
We'd like to get started again, so please take your seats. Councilwoman Price.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us again for the second segment. I have to say, I'm loving this interview. I'm completely engaged in every word that Renee is speaking, because it's just really interesting, and I love to see some of the similarities and some of the differences, and honestly, I'm learning a lot listening to her, and I hope that you are too. Now, I was asked over the break, the audience really, before we get into some of the historical and educational pieces, the audience is really craving some just good old-fashioned dirt. We want to know who was sleeping with who, what kind of horse trades were happening. We want to know some dirt.
Well, let's see. I guess I must say, incidentally, when Suzi was elected the first time. Many of her also elected colleagues, and we said, and the mayor, who was very young, well, let's see what the kids can do. So thank you for showing us what the kids can do.
Thank you for calling me a kid. That's awesome. I'm one of the oldest members of the council, so thank you.
And they really are. How about that's the oldest member?
I'm flattered. We should hang out more often.
Well, let's see. I guess we had the problem with our city planning director, Ernie Mayer. He was, we discovered, running a private consulting business from City Hall and using those staff who did not leave to work on his private clients. He was a landscape architect, I don't know, something, but in City Hall on city time.
This sounds like stuff we've heard in national politics lately. Just saying.
But he was also, he had showed me, I was interested at one point in maybe a condo in Palm Springs, and he said, well, let me show you, I'm trying to sell mine. And I knew what the city planning director was earning, I don't know, $35,000, whatever a year. And he said, well, here on the patio, we've got cold water running in pipes underneath, so when you play ping pong, you can play barefoot and it won't bother you. And here's the bedroom with the mirrored ceiling. And I'm thinking, really?
That right there is a story.
And so it turned out that to pay for all those additional things he liked, he was getting bribes from local architects who might want to work with the city. And if you wanted a job with the city, you paid him off. And two of those guys finally got tired of paying to play. And they were carrying wires for the county prosecutor. And they picked him up. We had a team of 40 FBI people in town. As he was putting into the trunk of his car these Mexican pesos, gold Mexican pesos, they arrested him. And he put his time in prison happily. But that was what we knew about, but I am certain that there were a lot of pay for play throughout the city. And I was reading, and I put together a book which should be here, but it isn't, about particularly the 70s. But one of the things I had read in the newspaper at the Historical Society was 4 council people who were who had taken $1,000 bribes, but they weren't bribes, these were campaign contributions for the city to permit some business to use a city parking lot. And so for their $1,000 contributions, so to speak, they voted in favor of this company getting the parking lot. But that was, I don't know if it was accepted, it just wasn't unaccepted. And so the things they used to say, one of the people I interviewed for my book, it said, well, you know, in those days, Renee, if a developer wanted something to happen in favor of his development, the process was you start first at 6th and Pine, which was the then address of the local newspaper. Then you go to 120 Linden, which was a law firm, the George Hart Jr. Law firm, and he was the the go-to person if you wanted a development. And then you end up with the city manager's office. But that was the process you had to go through if you wanted to get anything done in the city. So, and things that were happening that I was just too naive to know were happening. And I'm just as glad not to have known, actually. Nobody offered me, you know.
Probably because you were too smart.
No.
Well, I think so. I think that has something to do with it. You were smart and honest and in it for the right reasons. You would have split. Yes, you would have told, yes. So one of the things that you had a very significant part in the history of Long Beach and the Long Beach that we are today, many things, but one of them that a lot of people don't associate you with is El Dorado Park. So tell us a little bit about that and how it came to be what we know today as our largest park in the city.
Which is 900 and something acres on the far east end of the city. And I really don't know how the city acquired that land. But it was, in fact, the residents of the newer housing on the East End were having fundraisers to raise money to support getting that land developed as a park. And we finally put together a committee. I chaired that committee. And we finally persuaded the city council to put on the ballot it was 10 cents per dollar, I guess, 10%, for 10 years, a increase of the property tax because the city used to set its own property taxes. And that money would be designated for the development of El Dorado Park. It was very difficult because you could put houses on that land. There were, when I lived over in that part, there were cows. I mean, we had farms over there. But we worked with the PTAs, who were very helpful in persuading people to support this ballot measure. The man who really spearheaded it all, he owned, oh God, I'll think of his name in a minute, but he owned the drive-in movie where Kmart now is over there. It was a big drive-in movie, and he was pretty well-to-do, but he was from New York. And he said, houses near Central Park have higher value than any residence not near the park. So being near the park is a big boost for property values. And so we should develop this park over here, and that's going to be good for the city. It was quite an interesting thing as a grassroots campaign to get people to support taxing themselves for 10 years. But by golly, it passed. It was narrow, but we got it passed. And as a consequence, we've got this magnificent, and the concern was it would be a regional park. Why should Long Beach be spending its money for a park that will be used by people from all over? But every time I drive by and I see people at picnics and baseball, and I'm just absolutely thrilled with what we were able to do. At one point, before it got developed, when the Angels baseball team was coming to the West Coast, and some of our colleagues on the city council thought, well, we could get them to build the Angels baseball stadium on that 900 and something acres. They wouldn't have thought about, there were residences, how would you get in and out? It was terrible. But nonetheless, we beat them all down, and as a consequence, the city has this magnificent open space, golf course, green, trees. It's just lovely.
Well, I think we all thank you for your role in that, because
Milt Arthur, that was his name, Milt Arthur, and we named one of the lakes in his honor.
I think preserving open space continues to be an important priority, not just for our city, but cities everywhere as density continues to grow. So I think the efforts to preserve that, it's interesting to hear you talk about the early efforts and what we have today, because I'm sure at the time that you were trying to promote the initiative, there was some opposition.
Sure.
And it's hard to explain to people the vision that you have, because it's going to take so many years for that vision to be realized. So that leads me to my next question, which is, did you find, and have you found, and I think this is probably a question that's applicable to all times, that sometimes people are very resistant to change, and that that as a policymaker, it's difficult because what people will say if they're resistant to the change that you're proposing is, you're not listening to me. And what I like to tell people a lot is, just because I don't agree with you does not mean you're not being heard. How did you maneuver that in some of the things that you pushed forward on that at the time may have been resisted by others? And I'll go through some of the examples, but you know, you did a lot of things in terms of, you know, obtaining staff for council members, more importantly, encouraging diversified hiring practices at the city level. So how were you able to convince your constituents, those around you, that you were going to be moving forward on changes even if they didn't agree, and that the hesitation to change wasn't going to be a roadblock to progress?
We didn't always succeed. In 1975 was the first International Women's Year. The conference was in Mexico City. And my colleagues, I was the only woman, they said, Renee, you can go and represent Long Beach. And I said, oh, okay, I'm glad to do that. And one of the outcomes, it was a fascinating experience, but one of the outcomes was to develop a status of women commission in cities all over, you know, that would be concerned with the things that we know, whether it's salaries or positions or equal opportunities. And I said, oh, that's a snap, I'll do that. And so we then had to have, nobody on the council wanted to support me. A status of women commission, that sounded, I don't know, communist, something terrible, whatever it was. In fact, one of my colleagues said, well, how about a status of men's commission? And so we did have some public hearings, and the women who came to object kept talking about status of women is S-O-W. And they kept talking about sows. It was just ugly, really ugly. But it never, like the Equal Rights Amendment, it just, it died. I could not make that happen. And I thought it would be so easy. That's my naivety. So not always did we succeed in the things we attempted to do. But most of the time, I said, I couldn't do it from me. It had to come from someplace else, from some other person. At that time, the little business area at 7th and Pacific Coast Highway in Bellflower, and then it's now Target, but it used to be Ralph's and stuff. And so that they had come to the council for that development. And I said, gee, they could set aside 10 feet or whatever of their property, and it could be a bicycle lane. A what? A bicycle lane. You know, because then the college was right across the street, the VA hospital was across the street, there was lots of traffic. That didn't go well either. You're going to take property away from a private person to make a bicycle lane. And so the things that were perhaps more controversial would had to have been fronted by somebody other than me.
And do you think that had to do with your gender mostly?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think your gender probably to a large degree, but I would venture to say that your personality is also strong and you believe passionately about what you're advocating for. Did you find that that was threatening to some?
It's hard to understand today what it was like for women in 1970. One of the things I needed to do, we had two secretaries, one was the mayor's and one was for the rest of the council. And I sat down with the secretary, who was the council secretary, to talk with her about how she would feel about working for a woman. And, you know, people say, why would you even have to? It was important to do that, and she was appreciative. She didn't think it would be easy at all. But she was appreciative that I recognized that she would be uncomfortable having somebody suggesting things for her to do who was a woman. And so it was a world apart from today. And you know, if you're, you know, of that era, you could appreciate it. But if you're, you know, 20 or 30 or even 40 today, it's hard to understand that sitting down and talking with a woman employee was something that was essential to do. So,
that's a really great point. You know, during the time that you served on the council, were there any department heads who were female? And if so, did you find that they were more willing to collaborate with you and help you along the way? Or did you find that they were harder on you?
City librarian, that's a woman's job, right? Being a librarian. City librarian was a woman, and the city clerk was a woman. And those were the only women in positions of leadership in the administration. The city manager was, with some persuasion, was nice enough to set up we created a committee, a department that would be concerned with issues having to do with consumers. And he said, in the city council chambers aloud, we're going to appoint a woman to chair that, to be the department head there, and it's your fault, Renee. Thank you. But that was it. Yeah.
And what did you find in terms of how you were treated by the department heads and how your male colleagues were treated? Did you feel that they were able to move their projects forward more seamlessly? Or because they were afraid you might be the squeaky wheel, they did things out of fear that you might take issue with how they were conducting themselves?
They didn't have projects. Really, I'm quite serious. And I think that was part of what the management was concerned about, is that I was suggesting things to do that had not been done, and so that wasn't an issue. Yeah.
So, reflecting on your time in the city of Long Beach, clearly you've made it home. Your beautiful family is here. You've raised them here. How have you seen the city change? Are you optimistic about where it's headed?
I am extremely optimistic, and book that's supposed to be in print and isn't yet.
Which everyone is encouraged to purchase and read.
What I felt was that programs and projects that were developed during the 70s have taken maybe 40 years, but they are what are at the root of why this city is as good as I believe it is. And that, that was, maybe in 1972, the voters of California adopted a Coastal Act, Proposition 20. Were it not for that, Ocean Boulevard would be a stream of galaxies from one end to the other. There was no controlling the development that was happening on where the bluff begins at 36th or whatever that is, Miramar. That one segment of the bluff was still in private ownership. And the city had been negotiating to purchase it so that the city would have but they dawdled, and eventually the city did buy it for, I think, like $7 million. But on that parcel were planned 2 15-story condos. A setback of literally, and I read it, I wish I could remember where, but 1 inch. In other words, lot line to lot line was just going to be these 15-story buildings because there wasn't room for more than that. Were it not for Proposition 20 and the Coastal Act, that's the kind of development that we would have seen because there was no controlling it. The people who controlled the development were in power. And so I'm sure that eventually the affirmative action issues would have come about, but between Jim Wilson and me, we sat with the city manager and said we want to see how we're progressing, how many people are being moved out of traditional women's jobs into other positions, how many black men are being moved off the trash cans and into other opportunities. And it would have, taken time, but we really began to nag and make a difference. We have a wonderful program in Long Beach Recreation, the junior lifeguards. And if you go during the summer, you see hundreds of kids down on the beach all practicing. Well, that used to be a program that was only open to boys because what do girls know about being lifeguards? Well, I had just seen my daughter get her life-saving certificate at the pool. So I knew that girls could do this. But the whole mentality, to be a police officer, you had to be 5'10" or more. Why? Because it's a job that requires physical strength. There would be no women. There would be no Hispanics who were of smaller stature. And we finally persuaded them to say, well, all right, we'll test them on their ability to do this and not make an assumption that if you're not 5'10", you can't do it. There was all of the myths that City Hall was living with and that nobody chose to question. So we could do so much, or I could do so much because there was so much to do, no matter where you looked.
Well, I'm grateful that you did that, and it's interesting that you mentioned the Junior Guard program. Both of my boys were part of that program, and the year I took office, we had a new director for marine safety, and he has a daughter, and he really wanted to change the name of the race that they do at the end of the junior guard program, which used to be called the Iron Man. I mean, the stud Iron Man, right? And so he changed the name to the Iron Guard, okay? And I supported him. I mean, I'm one of those people who believes you have to allow managers to, do their own thing and let them grow and fail and succeed, and that's how they become better managers. And so I was not about to micromanage that, and frankly, I agreed with it. And he called me and he said, I think I'm going to change this name. It's going to be controversial in your district. I said, I'm sure people have more important things to worry about than calling it this. Oh my gosh, it was the most controversial thing, and it was the same summer that I got elected, and groups of moms were making appointments to come and meet with me, and these are women who had elected me to office because I was a PTA mom. That was my base, so to speak. And they were coming and they were saying, this is outrageous. It's always been the stud Iron Man. I can't. My daughters are offended that you're changing the name. And if you don't change it back, we're all leaving the program. And I was just shocked. I mean, this was like meeting after meeting. I think at one meeting I may have said, this is a first world problem. But I don't remember if those were exactly the words that I used, but something to that effect that resulted in people being offended. But the point is, and I said, well, if you feel that the change in the name is so serious for you. First of all, your kids aren't worried about this. It's you and your husband who are talking about this, and people talking about this at cocktail parties that's perpetuating this, because your kids don't care. It's a great program. The next year, so I said to Gonzalo, who's the Marine Bureau chief, I said, I think we're going to have a mass exodus. These moms are all saying they're going to leave. And he said, okay, I feel strongly about this. I think it's we need to make it so that more females feel comfortable and confident, and he talked about the history of what a stud is and all this stuff, and I said, okay, we're going to go with Iron Guard. And you know what, the next year it was the most attendance we've had in the program ever. And the great thing about it is we got kids from all over Long Beach because he was so active in his recruitment. It made me really proud. And you know what, here we are 4 years later, nobody's talking about whether it's the stud Iron Man or the Iron Guard. So it was really great. But I will tell you, a funny thing about it is one of the moms, who clearly has nothing better to do with her days, ordered bracelets for all the kids who finished the Iron Guard that says, you are still a stud to us. Oh. And tried to slap one of those on my kids, and I said, don't you dare take that bracelet. We're protesting that bracelet. So it just goes back to the change, and here we are 4 years later, most of the kids don't know any different, and they love the program. It's an amazing program. So thank you for having started that trend, because it's been very, very powerful for the city. One of the things I want to ask you, and I think this is probably a question that would apply in politics no matter what generation or era, but do you believe that in your time there were special interest groups who had influence over council members? And do you believe that has, over time, with transparency and more reporting of things, do you believe that has lessened? Or as an outsider, do you still see that happening?
We had a very influential citizens group, Labachi, Long Beach area citizens involved. Anybody remember Labachi? They were responsible for district elections. They were responsible for citywide mayor being solely a mayor. They really had they exerted enormous influence because they could persuade other people to support those ideas. And I feel very strongly that, I must admit that district elections killed me, but nonetheless, the influence of community groups acting in a rational way, and sometimes they get, it's more than just not in my backyard. But that's really what I think will keep the city on a sensible course.
You raise a good point. The group that you referenced were actual citizens
Yes.
of the city.
Yes.
There are many interest groups, I think, that have political power who are not necessarily citizens of this of the community that they're advocating in, maybe part of a larger advocacy organization. What role, if any, do you think they have in local politics?
I don't think I'm in the spot where I would feel that, you know, and I'm not a part of such a group, so I don't know. Now, we have, for example, you were very, very creative in funding opening a library on Sundays. We have the Long Beach Public Library Foundation. Okay. And that's a group that we're citizens, remember, but we're a strong, active, and I believe influential group in furthering the place of the opportunities for library users in Long Beach. But it's still, basically, it's a citizen. It's not a union. Mm-hmm. It's not a public safety group and others that might be beyond that.
You bring up a good point that I wanted to make sure I talked to you about. You have remained incredibly active in the city of Long Beach since you left office, and I thank you for that. But I want to talk to you about what organizations you're involved in and why those are important for you when you're thinking about the future of our city.
Well, I really care about Long Beach, you know, and that's and it matters to me that I can, in some way, still have some offer some direction in what kind of a city I want to live in. And so, you know, the groups that I'm involved in, the Regional Arts Council, and we have an obligation, and thank you for helping to provide some 1% funding for the Arts Council.
She's my special interest group, because everything she's involved in, I have supported.
The Library Foundation, and so, yeah, the League of Women Voters. I've been happy to have been appointed to, my term's up now, but to the Board of Health. And that's been a great opportunity to do what had not been done before, not through my influence particularly, but trying to work to get the individual council members aware of what happens in the Board of Health. I mean, the health department is almost 98% funded without city funds, so it's a very important service. So,
Did you guys hear her lobbying? But it's budget season. Did you hear that? Did you catch that?
Well, I've got you here. But yeah, so the organizations that I've chosen to be involved in are organizations that I feel I can have some influence in improving the city and issues that I'm particularly concerned with, and I think somebody else will be concerned about other things, you know. But, you know.
What's your wish for this city?
Well, I would hope that we talked about people's involvement. I would hope that the city would continue to be attentive to the voice of people who live here. I mean, some of the things that groups support that I don't feel are necessarily the best way, but if people can be persuaded and educated to think I'm not just worrying about myself, but my kids want to live here, they have to find jobs here, they have to find housing they can afford, that we continue to be responsive to the people who are living here. Because through that 70s, there was no attention to anything that the people wanted. You know, the Planning Commission would have hearings, would not have hearings that the state law mandated, recommending changes to general plan. And no voice was ever heard from public. They would vote without public hearings. And a city attorney was sitting there knowing that. So that's a very important thing, I think, to us, that we live here, we need to be attended to for what kind of a city do you want this to be. And so I would hope that people would continue to not sit out elections. The local election is probably the most important election we've got. And so, you know, when you get 17% turnout, it's pretty sickening. So those are the things I would hope that people would continue to be attentive to what's happening here and concerned about helping to make it the kind of city we want it to be. Yeah.
When you reflect upon your life and you think about this city, what would you say is the biggest gift that you've received from this city? Or your opportunities in this city?
Well, I think the opportunity to make a difference is a big opportunity. You know, I've done a lot of things career-wise in my life, but serving on the city council was the greatest privilege that I could have ever dreamed of having, because you got 9 people. You can really change enormous things. And so it's a remarkable opportunity to serve, and I would encourage all women to get very much concerned. I feel it's very important that women realize that this is a role for everybody, and that I encourage young women, high school students, college students, to think about public service and public office, because it's a great privilege. Yeah.
You're making me feel really guilty about regretting or dreading Tuesday nights. I'm no longer going to do that.
Well, it's a hard job. It's a very hard job. Yeah.
Now, you had the privilege to be on the council. You've also had the privilege of having a family. Tell me a little bit about how those two worlds merged and how important it was, the role that your family provided you in supporting you.
Well, let's see, my younger son was here as a professional musician, and he used to bring his band out to campaign for me. They'd sit on the back of a flat truck.
Are you still available?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We can work something out.
And when my daughter moved to a smaller community out in the valley, and I said, how many people live there? And she told me, I said, oh, great, you could run for school board. Mother! So I think, to some extent, my kids may have been turned off a bit, but I would hope that what I have been doing in the community has been able to provide for my family an incentive to do more than just be sure you vote, but to be involved in some way, because the city we live in, wherever we are, is totally a function of how much each citizen, each person puts into making it the kind of city you want it to be, or else stop complaining, because it's
Now, you did not have the beautiful invention of social media at the time that you served on the council. But I do know that you're engaged with technology, you participate in it, you clearly see how the world around is changing, because we talk about that a lot in terms of arts education and libraries and incorporating technology into our daily lives. Technology and the internet specifically and social media have really changed engagement. What challenges and opportunities do you see if you think about it in that sense?
It's interesting. You sit in a restaurant and you see two people having dinner, and each one is looking at their cell phone. I don't know if they're talking to each other electronically, but my concern is that this has really created a separation and an isolation for people. Way back when dancing was changed from the typical traditional dancing that I knew, and I would look and I'd say, they're not touching each other. They're not even looking at each other. It seemed to me that so much of our culture is separating people rather than bringing them together. And I'm concerned about this. I tell people I learned to use the telephone, and I learned to turn on the radio, so don't bother me with Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of that stuff. But I think I can see a transition to looking at yourself rather than interacting with people. You walk down the street and everybody's looking at their palm, and that's not what you want. You want people to talk to each other, not to talk to their electronic document.
And isn't it true that when people are looking at another person in the face, it's so much harder to be cruel than it is from behind a screen?
Right. You hide behind. You don't have to relate. Yeah. That's scary.
Well, you've continued to be so incredibly engaged in the city. Do you intend on taking on more, slowing down, staying the same? What are you thinking?
I'm going to be working on improving my Spanish. That's my next project. Yeah. So I think it's time to see what the kids can do.
Tell us a little bit about your book.
Oh, yeah, I think it turned out pretty good. And I said the things that I saw happening in the 60s, in the 70s, that I think are today coming to fruition. And I don't know why it took 40 years, but things happen slowly in this town. But I talked about some of those things, not only the Coastal Act, the place of women in government, which I think is important. A very important issue which I was not personally involved in, but was the issue of Poly High School. Have we got any Poly High School people here? No, but yeah, in the 70s, Poly High School, because it's located in what we call the central area, at least at that time, but its student body drew from the most affluent, exclusively white communities of Bixby Knolls, Los Cerritos, and from, at that time, an area that was exclusively African American. In fact, a person of color could not rent or buy a house any place in the city. No realtor would cross that line. And so at one point, some problems arose among the kids, and the school administration at that time said, well, do something about it. And they were fortunate enough, we as a city were fortunate enough for them to have a counselor, I believe she was a counselor, an English teacher, Gray, what was her first name? I can't think of it now. But she had learned about what was then not very common, and certainly not in Long Beach, of having target schools. So she decided that would be a way to help Polly out of its dilemma. And she said, we're going to have programs at Polly that I guarantee you, if your kid qualifies, and you had to come in by exam, if your kid qualifies and follows through, your kid will have everything that he or she needs to get into the top schools in the East, or any college you want, any Ivy League school. And so at that point, they started to put together, she's put together curriculum for what, I don't know, today we call, top-notch classes, but yeah, and it worked. And pretty soon, rather than moving, because there was a white flight all over the country, and the concern at Poly was that if that happens, we'd end up with a school of a single race, and that was not what they wanted. And then for sure, busing would be required. And so the school, Poly, became the school of choice. And I was told in other parts of the country, parents would say, I'm not going to send my kid into that neighborhood. But because the programs were so desirable, even today, the classes, the courses that are available are so outstanding that, and at that time, you had to go to the high school in your neighborhood. But at Poly, they would accept kids from any place, any part of the city. And it became, it just solved enormous amounts of problems and kept Poly as a healthy, interracial school, even though it was located in a neighborhood that otherwise parents were very apprehensive about sending their white kids from Los Cerritos down to the central area. So there were a number of programs like that were happening at that time that I thought we could identify, and that's what I've done in this book. And as a consequence, a lot of the history that we've been talking about came out too. So if it ever gets out of the printer, I think people would find it. It's small, but I think people would find it interesting.
Well, there is so much about you and about your history that I think we could talk about tonight. Things that I didn't even get to, that Renee is a pilot. She somehow managed to find time to become a pilot. That she challenged Senator Duke Majan at the time to a state Senate seat. That she has been such a pivotal voice in this city in terms of policy, not just when she served on council, but every day following the end of her service on council. She's, I think you'll agree with me, an amazing, amazing woman in this city and has shaped so much of what we know today to be this wonderful city that makes me proud to raise my kids here. So you should know that we're raising our family here because of the work that people like you did to make it what it is. So thank you for that.
We've got a one-woman
We have, this completes the formal portion of the interview for the Historical Society's oral history interview of Councilwoman Renee Simon. We have a few minutes remaining, and I want to use this time first to thank Renee for volunteering to be interviewed by me tonight. And although I think I tried to keep the conversation enjoyable by a few cracks here and there, I will say it is my privilege and my honor to serve in this city. And I learn from you every day, and I know that the audience here does as well as we continue to serve our city. And I want to see if there are any questions from the audience on topics that maybe I didn't cover or that you want to know more about. So Ian is going to walk around with the microphone, so please raise your hands and he will come to you.
This is personal, and it goes back to the first part. What influence would you say your mother had on you?
She took me every time she went to vote. The person I think that had the most influence on me was the woman maybe I mentioned, who was the wife of my English professor in college, Marion Groves. Her husband, it turned out, these were very liberal Democrats, but her husband was was General Groves, who was influential in the atomic bomb project. And he didn't even like to talk about his brother. But she was the one who said, join the League of Women Voters, stay involved, get involved in your government. I mean, she was the really one who pushed and opened the whole idea to me. I would not have thought of that particularly, you know.
Hi. I have solar panels on my house because I want to reduce my carbon footprint. I really do think the city needs to advocate for solar panels. It's at a great expense to me, and it'll be a great expense to the city. But eventually, it'll all pay off, because right now we are putting over 100 oil wells on our last remaining wetlands, with the idea that somehow, if we create some kind of a plan where we're going to restore them, it's good for the city. But later on, because of global warming, they're going to be inundated, so it's not going to make any difference. How can we start a movement for solar panels for the city to create revenue and stop trying to get oil out of here?
Yeah. No, that swap that we made, that the Coastal Commission approved of recently, it's very nice. We got all the wetlands we're going to be able to develop, but it's true. It's true. We're encouraging the drilling and using oil. We shouldn't be, but I see lots of solar panels on every big parking lot. The campus has solar panels all over the campus now. The other buildings, the Jewish Community Center in Long Beach, has solar panels all over their parking lot. So I think maybe the idea will spread. I don't know. It's a trade-off somehow.
Hi, Renee. You touched on your experience with Dow Chemical, how they said we don't hire women, and you just took that answer as it was and didn't think anything of it. At that time that was happening to you, I was in grade school, and I was starting petitions because I wanted girls to be altar boys. And I think it's kind of generational that you didn't think to ask why, and us little girls were saying, why? Was there a point in your life where you finally said, this is ridiculous, women can do things, and what was that pivotal point, and what did you do about it?
Well, I think it also, when you've got when the opportunity is there, then if you can take advantage of it. We started the first National Council of Jewish, the National Organization for Women in Long Beach. We Nationalist Political Caucus, which started in my living room. And so when the opportunity is there, you try to take advantage of it. And if, you know, I was in a position where if I called people and said, hey, let's try to do this, they were responding. So, but before you have the opportunity, it's pretty hard to know there's even something to do, you know. Yeah.
Hi again, Renee. Thank you so much for being here this evening and for sharing with us. I want you to know it's a badge of honor for me to have worked in your campaign when you ran for Senate way back. And you worked with all of us, Carmen Perez, and a lot of us cut our teeth on getting involved in the community with you. At the time you were on the Long Beach City Council, was Councilwoman Eunice Sato also serving with you during that time? And how was it with your involvement versus her involvement?
During my second term, Eunice was elected to the council. we perceived things from a different perspective.
I'm going to write that down.
So,
Very classy.
yeah, I mean, issues that came before the council, I think I made an effort for us to, you know, not be on really, you know, severely different points of view, but I don't think it had to do particularly with Eunice's, you know, when you've got 9 people on a council, not often are they all going to agree to things anyway.
Next. We're ready for the next question.
Hi, Lauren here. Who was your mentor during the time that you were in the council? It sounds like when you were in the council, even though you were the only woman, you still worked with some men that respected you, but there might have been maybe some other men that not nearly as smart as you, but got way more things for them than you did. And how did you deal with that? Who did you commiserate with? Like, who did you go have a drink with after a council meeting and say, can you believe that person did this? So on and so forth. Did you have anybody, or were you alone?
Well, my husband used to take me out Tuesday nights for a drink. I think that one of the things that was very helpful was our statewide elected women's organization, and as I said, there were not very many of us, but part of the reason that we had this group was that I could get on the phone and call Suzi Gray in San Jose and say, how do you handle this issue, and get perspective from other women. And you knew that you could call a woman elected official and you'd get a square, honest answer. And that was very important to us. And that was really the source, I think. Sheila, I don't know if you were part of the CWAR, but that was really the thing that made it possible to really manage, was having the women in other city councils who you could share ideas with and get support from, because they were all facing the same kind of I don't know if it's hostility, but lack of respect from men. Most of them were just the one woman on a council, and so we were very helpful for each other.
Renee, do you feel that the role of the university has changed over the years? And what has been the impact of that change?
You must remember also, Bonnie, when people in the city didn't know we had a university. It's unbelievable, right? That it was, no, the concept of town and gown didn't exist. It was, you know, the university's on the east end of town, but most people, I think, really were not even aware that we had a state university right here in Long Beach. And what did they, you know, they have a very strong arts department, and we could, you know, I could take advantage and go to this, you know, annual Christmas exhibit of stuff to buy, or they had a strong drama department. People didn't go on campus to enjoy or participate in what a university could offer to a community. It was like two different worlds. And I really think that it was Bob Maxon that made the difference in making people aware, and his California scholars, his Long Beach scholars, he did a bang-up job, but it was, I don't think it was until then that people really began to realize the advantages of having an academic institution right here in our own town.
So I have to add a little something to that. So President Maxon's first year at Cal State Long Beach was the year I was student body president. So I was the beneficiary of his learning about the university and the town and everything that's wonderful about Long Beach during that first year. And it really was just such a dynamic time. I was getting my master's, so I'd already been there for 4 years, so I got to see just the huge difference between his leadership and the leadership before. And I completely agree with you. I mean, he was such an incredible, charismatic leader and just injected a new life to the campus that I think remains today. Under President Conley's leadership. So I agree with you. I think it was an incredible time. It was interesting because the pyramid, we actually have a picture with me and President Maxon in hard hats on the cover of the Daily 49er doing the groundbreaking for the pyramid. And I did not realize then, what I know now as a councilwoman, how contentious the meetings were regarding the structure of the pyramid in that neighborhood, and the architectural opinions that people had, and just I didn't realize it. I was just a student on campus, and we were going to have this great building where we're going to have games. But now I realize as a councilwoman how, you know, people come to meetings to talk about the types of plants I want to plant in a park. Imagine the kind of contention that was going on about this big, huge blue pyramid right on Atherton, and he just handled it beautifully and masterfully. So that's just a little personal thought.
Well, Renee, you were my inspiration. She really was. I used to, whenever she said anything, or I wanted to be there, because I was running around trying to help her get elected. Of course, I don't know how much I did. But you were the inspiration that got me to run for the assembly. I never really expected to win, but I did. And I was into the political world. But she was really an inspiration, and I talked to her a lot, and I wanted her to win and go to the States so badly. But it takes a lot of work, and if it hadn't been for her and people like Bonnie here, we're lucky in this area. We have a lot of good people, and Renee was really, and also she had a good sense of humor, you know, just to give me a hard time, which I liked. And
well, I'm really pleased to have been in some way influential in you being in the Assembly and the State Senate, and you're a great gal.
Well, people like you made it happen, though. One thing I have to say, though, about my upbringing, in Western Kentucky, everybody talked to everybody, and I was president of my class that had 38 members. And I was always president, not because I knew what I was doing, because nobody else wanted to do it. That was really it. But politics comes sort of, if you're from Western Kentucky, it's just sort of natural, you know. Well, that's all. I just think, Renee, we are so lucky to have her. We are so lucky.
Well, thank you to the Historical Society for hosting this this event and for asking us to participate. It was a true pleasure. Thank you.